what I want to do really is to talk about the way in which production and reproduction, if you like, or what's sometimes called social reproduction, are linked under capitalism, and how important this is in terms of creating and recreating, if you like, the question of women's oppression. So I'll do my best, as I say, to do it in that time. I hope we'll have lots of time for people to comment or agree or disagree or whatever people, or ask questions, obviously. So what I want to start with is a quote not from Marx but from Engels, that Engels is, one of the things he's most famous for is his book The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State. And he writes in the preface to the first edition of this that he says this is a fulfillment of a bequest that I made to Marx, because Marx, who died in 1883, not long before this was published, was very involved in discussing and researching some of this work around where women's oppression comes from, looking at ancient societies and how important they were. And so Engels makes this point that this is for Marx, this book, and that this was a collaboration with Marx in the years before he died. But he also says in this first preface, it's a very famous quote that he gives, that I just want to read a little bit of. And he says, according to the materialistic conception, the determining factor in history is, in the last resort, the production and reproduction of immediate life. But this itself is of a twofold character. On the one hand, the production of the means of subsistence, of food, clothing, and shelter, and the tools requisite therefore. On the other, the production of human beings themselves, the propagation of the species. The social institutions under which men of a definite historical epoch and of a definite country live are conditioned by both kinds of production, by the stage of development of the labor on the one hand and of the family on the other. Now, as I say, this is a very famous quote, which has formed the basis for a lot of Marxist writing and discussion, and a sort of starting point for lots of people in trying to understand about where oppression comes from. And Engels also makes the point later on in that same quote that the more you have a development of society, the more advanced the society becomes in terms of production, in terms of what it can produce, the wealth that it has in society, the more important production becomes in relation to reproduction. So the earliest societies, reproduction of the family, are absolutely central to what people do. As it gets more advanced, and obviously when we talk about capitalism, we're talking about an advanced industrial society, he says that production tends to dominate the system of reproduction. So I want to go through that a little bit as well. And the reason I wanted to start with this is because to him and to Marx, and I think to most Marxists who've written on this subject since, which encompasses a very wide range of people and of Marxists over the subsequent, 150 years or nearly 150 years, is that this connection between the two, the mode of production in which people live, the way in which they make their livelihoods, also will explain the way in which they reproduce. Now, at one level, obviously, people have always reproduced in the same way. It's a biological function. But he also says that, of course, it's a social function, and if you have the family or the family form fitting a particular sort of mode of production, as they called it. So I want to explain that. I'd like to start by saying that, of course, for Marx and Engels, and for me, and I think for most Marxists, these two systems are very, very much connected. You can't separate them off. There aren't, and this was a big argument. It's not so much a big argument today, but it's a big argument in the early days of what is sometimes called second wave feminism, of the women's liberation movement of the 1970s. There was this idea that you could separate them off, that you had dual systems, as it was sometimes called, that you had capitalism on the one hand and you had patriarchy as a separate system on the other. Now, I've always thought that that isn't the right way to approach the question of the family and of women's oppression. I think you have to see the two as obviously dealing with separate areas of life, but as very, very much integrated into one another. And therefore, I don't think there is a separate system of patriarchy. I don't think that this actually helps us to understand women's oppression. I think these two are very, very much connected. And to me, the conclusion of that, of course, is that if you can overthrow capitalism, you can also overthrow the oppressive system which it develops and which it creates. So that's, I suppose, the first point I wanted to make. The second point I wanted to make is to talk about the family today, because the title of the talk is Marxism, the Family and Women's Oppression. But of course, firstly, people have very different views of what the family is. I'm talking mainly about Britain here and other developed industrial countries, but obviously my most knowledge and experience is in this country. And of course, even within capitalism, you've had very different family forms in Britain and in other industrial societies. You know, Marx and Engels themselves believed that that capitalism would perhaps break down the old family completely, because it required women and children to go to work in the textile mills and in the factories, and that this would lead to the ties of the old traditional family breaking down and collapsing, and that therefore you wouldn't have this sort of family form. Now, I don't want to go into why that didn't happen. Again, there's long academic and Marxist debates about why that didn't happen in the 19th century and why the family actually became strengthened. But it's certainly true that by the early 20th century, the aim of most working class people was that once a woman married, she would work until she married. When she married, she tended to stay at home, certainly when she had children, and that the older children and the man would go out to work, and the woman would be the person who did all, or virtually all, the domestic labor of looking after younger children, and also the extensive domestic labor involved in a family where you don't have washing machines, you don't have electricity, you don't have any of these kind of things. So you had, I mean, even when I was a child, you had people who would have a whole day for a washing day, which was usually a Monday, or you'd have a baking day, or people would have these whole days dedicated to particular areas of domestic work, and they needed to, because there was a very large amount to do. Now, when we look at the family in the 21st century, people don't have washing days, baking days, and you could say every single day is the joy of washing, baking, dusting, and all the other things that we have to do. But you don't have these kind of things. And if you look at the family today, as capitalism developed in the 20th century, as housework, as you got things like electricity, and as housework became more mechanized, as you got machines that could do all sorts of elements of domestic labor, as all these things happened, it simply didn't really make any sense for the amount of domestic labor carried out by the mother and maybe the younger children in the home to be kept in the home. It made much more sense for capital to try to engage women as labor reserves. In other words, to see them as people who could work outside of the home as well as being in the home as well. So you had a situation where that mechanization of housework was accompanied by a push for women to go to work outside the home, even when they had children, even when they were married, even when they had children. And a lot of the legal barriers to that, for example, if you were a teacher, even in the 1950s, many authorities wouldn't allow you to continue to work as a teacher when you were married. There was a marriage bar. There were marriage bars in lots of factories that you had to go. That all got swept away by the 1950s at the latest, and particularly the Second World War had a big impact in terms of doing that. So you had a family structure where people still had to do privatized reproduction within the home, both in terms of caring for children and other members of the family, but also in carrying out domestic labor, even with the advantage of a washing machine or a dishwasher or any of those sorts of things. But you also had a phenomenon where women, what's called married women, although many of them these days may not be married, but particularly women who are mothers and mothers of school-aged children, now go out to work in an unprecedented to an unprecedented extent. And this is the phenomenon that I think we have to try to deal with when we're looking at women's oppression today. Now, if you look at individual relations within the family, this is how most people see the family. People don't see the family as a unit which is responsible for the reproduction of labor power, that it creates the next generation of workers who are absolutely essential to the smooth running of capitalism. In fact, nobody goes down the aisle in a white dress thinking they're doing it for the reproduction of labor power. They think they're doing it because they love their husband, they want to have children, they want to set up home in a nice house. They're doing it for all those reasons. In other words, people see it as an individual response, that you get to a certain age, you want to have children, you want to settle down, you want to do all these sorts of things. This is what the family is about. Now, of course, the family is about these things and contains within it the aspirations of millions of working people around the world, but it's about much, much more than that in terms of its role in capitalist society. And I would argue, I mean, again, I've written about this earlier, I don't want to do it at any great length. There was a big debate in the 70s about, do housewives, as they were called in those days, which people tend not to use that term now because it doesn't apply to most women, do housewives create value, and do they create surplus value? And the debate was that no, they created use values. In other words, they create, you cook a meal and somebody consumes the meal. Maybe you might make clothes for your family and they're consumed within the household. They're not exchanged on the market. And this was seen as a big difference between productive workers, people who worked in industry or who worked in an office, and people who were doing domestic labor at home. But in my view, that really underestimates the role of domestic labor in the home, because of course it does contribute not directly to the production of surplus value. You're not producing a commodity in the home which then goes on to be sold, or in most cases you're not. But you are producing or reproducing this incredibly valuable and central asset to capitalism, which is labor power, the ability to work in order to produce the wealth which in turn produces the profits of the capitalist. And therefore, I've always regarded domestic labor not as a kind of subsidiary aspect of capitalism, but actually as absolutely central to keeping the system going. And that, I think, if you look at it, is at the root of what the family in capitalism is about. And it's why the family doesn't disappear. There's lots of reasons why the family could, and some might argue should, disappear in its present form. That there has been a lot of breakdown of traditional values, for example. Far fewer people get married today. People tend to have fewer children than they might have done 50 or let alone 100 years ago. All of those things are a reality, but at the same time, you find that this family form, even with people who aren't married, even with people who don't have children, it still is the central form for this reproduction of labor power. And far from it disappearing in lots of ways, capitalist society itself, the state, the ideology, the media, all of these things actually acts to reinforce family values, if you want to call it this, traditional ideas that we should be in these institutions and everything else, which is why I think we have to look critically at some of the ideas that people have, that if you don't do certain things, you're not in a family or not in a traditional family. I mean, of course, there are women within the family who have passed their menopause or who don't have a menopause. There are women who don't have children. There are people who don't get married. There's now completely legally in this country and many other countries, and quite rightly, there's the possibility of lesbians and gays getting married, not just having a civil partnership, but getting married and therefore having the full marriage rights that heterosexual couples have. So all of those things, to me, they don't alter the basic setup of the family. In fact, in some ways, I would argue for gay and lesbian marriage, for example. I think it's been a way of capitalism actually accepting the reality of gay and lesbian life to a certain extent, but trying to incorporate it into a conventional structure, which is the family. And of course, the family plays all sorts of other, perhaps subsidiary, but important roles. It's a very important ideological conduit. You know, the stability of the family, the idea that there's a natural place for everybody. All of this is very important. It's a very, very important area of consumption. In fact, you could argue today that very little is produced in the family apart from labour power, but consumption within the family is something which has grown and which has become more important. I also think that when we talk about social reproduction and the reproduction of labour power, there's sometimes the argument put that you don't need a family form, a nuclear family, in order to reproduce labour power, in order to produce the next generation. And that obviously is true. You know, there are institutions which take the place of the family for better or worse, usually for worse, if you think about care institutions, if you think about prisons, if you think about any of those things. There's also an argument sometimes put that immigration, you know, that if you're looking for labour reserves, you look beyond your own domestic population. In other words, you look to getting people from the Philippines or from India or from Mexico to come to work in your country, and you haven't reproduced, you haven't had to cover the costs of the reproduction of their labour power. You haven't had to cover the costs of their healthcare, their socialization as children, their education, any of those things. But of course, that doesn't mean that wasn't done somewhere else. It doesn't mean that, you know, if you were in Mexico, somebody also did have a family where they brought up these children and socialized them and educated them, and where domestic labor was carried out. You're not breaking from that model. What you're doing in a way with mass immigration that we've seen under globalization is you're incorporating the other people's families into your workforce. That's the way in which it works. And indeed, as we know, there are many, many instances of women who come from across the world to care for other people's children when they're leaving their own children with grandparents or aunts and uncles because they need the money that they can earn here, pitiful though it might be, in order to help reproduce their family back in their home country. So I don't think that you escape the family model by looking at different sorts of, you know, the exceptions to the rule, if you like. I think it's something which is very, very predominant. And to me, this is where women's oppression maintains itself and comes from. And women don't need to be oppressed at one level, don't need to be oppressed in the same way that they were 100 years ago, 200 years ago in the textile factories and those sorts of things. But this family form structures their work, structures the attitudes towards women, structures their attitudes towards themselves in terms of all sorts of things like anorexia and all sorts of problems that particularly young women have with some of these questions, mental health, all these different sorts of things. And, you know, there's an argument as well that, you know, today people very often say, oh, women's oppression, it's got nothing to do with biology. Now, I just think that, you know, you simply can't look at it in that kind of way. I think you have to say it does have to do with biology. It has to do with many other things as well. We live in a society where sexuality is socially conditioned. We live in a society where all sorts of aspects of our lives as women and men are socially conditioned in all sorts of ways. You know, the expectations, that all the surveys that are done, even babies, the attitudes of, you know, older family members to whether it's a boy or a girl child is remarkably different even before anybody dresses them in pink or blue, practically, to reinforce those sort of sexual stereotypes. So of course there is social conditioning, but you also have to say, firstly, that the origin of the family that Engels talked about obviously had a strong biological dimension when you're talking about early societies. But I think you also have to say that there is that when you look at women's oppression today, it's very, very much connected to the fact that women are mothers or are expected to be mothers, that women have particular things that affect them in a way that they don't affect men. So I think those are important questions. A question of maternity, question of childbearing and rearing. So much of women's oppression today is related to how we see those questions and who we expect to be doing the work of childbearing and child rearing. So just to try and draw a few of these strands together, I think what we're looking at today, when you look at the contradictions with the family under capitalism, you've got this situation where there's an ideology of equality here, you know, that we're told everybody is equal, that women, there's nothing women can't do. You know, we've all got the chance to do all sorts of interesting jobs. We've all got the chance to have an education. We've all got the chance to do all sorts of different kind of things. Now, actually, the ideology of equality fails every single time. You look at any of the ways that you want to judge it. You know, we have a thing where now we publish the gender pay gap in companies of 250 people or above. We still haven't really begun to eradicate the gender pay gap. There's laws against discrimination of women who are on maternity leave, but it's a very, very common phenomenon. If you look at any employment, is a very, very common phenomenon. So it's a bit like, you know, Stalin had the 5-year plans where you know, you said certain amounts of wheat are going to be produced or certain amount of steel is going to be produced. And there was no relationship between the plan and what was actually produced. And I would argue the ideology of equality, there's no relationship or very little relationship between that ideology of equality, which, you know, even governments and even, you know, we have conservative women MPs, we have, you know, a vice president of the US who's about to be inaugurated, who's a woman. All these people tell us it's equal, but there is no real connection between that ideology and the reality for billions of women around the world, actually. So I think that's an important thing, and it fails because of the economic reality, which is the connection between the reproduction of labour power in the home and the amount of unpaid labour which is carried out mainly by women, not just by women, but mainly by women. And of course, alongside this, I think there's now a coupling of this with a lack of recognition of continuing oppression. I mean, it's almost as if, you know, women are half the world. So half the world, leaving aside all other oppressions, is oppressed in terms of these questions. But it's almost like that's just factored in, you know, to the equation. The same as it's true, the working class is by far the majority of the population of the world, or working people, if you want. Obviously, you're talking about poor peasants as well in this situation. You're talking about working people being the majority of the population of the world. In Britain, the working class, a big majority of the population, and yet as a group, it's kind of ignored, and when it's not ignored, it tends to be denigrated or, you know, looked at as either deeply reactionary or going out on strike all the time, or all the other ways that it's looked at. And I think this is a thing we need to really be aware of. Just a couple of final points I want to make, and perhaps I can only really just touch on them in the time that I've got, and perhaps people might want to, I'm sure people will want to respond to some of these. My critique of identity politics, I think identity politics is important in terms of, you know, people stand up and say, I'm a woman, I'm black. This was a very important development from the 1960s, that the movements of the 1960s brought us that awareness of oppression of all sorts of different groups of people, the Vietnamese, you know, all the colonial struggles that there were. But identity politics on its own is, in my view, a form of kind of utopianism. It's a, you know, it's an idea that is, you know, a perfectly valid idea, but it contains within it no mechanism as to how you change the world. And indeed, the mechanism it does have is to say, well, my identity is different from yours, and my, you know, am I slightly higher up the hierarchy of the different groups of the oppressed? And I think it's not a helpful theory in my view. And another subordinate point about it is actually it's quite often used by quite conservative forces in order to justify all sorts of things. For example, the war in Afghanistan, was about liberating women, supposedly. So there's those sort of problems with identity politics. Privilege theory, I think there's even more problems with, actually. I think the idea that a lack of oppression among one group of people is tantamount to a privilege over another group of people, I think it deliberately obscures the class division under which we live. I think it deliberately says, that there's that even within the working class, there's so many privileges. What's the difference between that and all the other classes, and so on? And I think it just doesn't help us to understand the way in which society works. So to me, I mean, I've had a debate with somebody on Facebook, as I'm sure we all do, in the last few days about the coup or alleged coup in Washington, and saying, wasn't this an example of white privilege? Because if it was a Black Lives Matter thing, they would have not let them into the Capitol and would have shot a lot of them before they got anywhere close, which I mean is absolutely the assessment, I think, is absolutely true. But of course, that isn't just about white privilege. This is about a political difference. This is about the right wing and the far right are protected and supported by some of the forces, at the very least, of the state in the US. And I mean, I think it's a wrong way to look at it. And it divides up the fact that actually white people who demonstrate in support of Black people, white people who go on strike, white people who fight against the fascists will all find themselves faced with some of the same problems that people who are Black face. Now, which isn't to say at all that there's no difference. I don't want to make that point at all. But I'm just saying that you have to look at this in terms of class. So I think I'll conclude there.